Hello, I'm Angel Vasquez, and today I'm going to talk about political indicators affecting COVID-19 containment efforts. The problem is that more than 50.1 million have tested positive worldwide towards COVID-2, and more than 1.25 million have died. It appears that in Europe and the United States account for more than half of all global deaths. However, these regions represent only 15% of the world population. Meanwhile, there have been authoritarian countries such as China that has among the lowest case and death counts between all countries in the world, despite being the disease's origin. Other democratic countries that were not as wealthy, or authoritarian regimes that were not as wealthy, seem to have fared better than their wealthier and more democratic counterparts. So it leaves the question open towards asking, does effective containment of the pandemic in a given country depend on its socio-political development, political freedom, or both? So, using this question, I researched the literature available in crisis management among different kinds of institutions, both private and public around the world. The most shocking revelation within this survey of literature is that Pearson and Clay in 1998 showed that more resourceful and inclusive organizations had better crisis management outcomes despite cultural differences or other kinds of organizational differences. Bennett et al. In 2008 reached the same conclusion as Pearson and Clay, but applied it in the context of liberal democracies facing international and international challenges, where they found that wealthier democracies, as well as those that afforded more freedoms to citizens, had better methods to cope with international and internal problems facing their countries, compared to countries which were not as wealthy and were not as democratic as those that were compared to. However, recent experiences, especially the COVID-19 pandemic, indicates that not all governments are willing to take these steps and that some poor and illiberal countries can manage global crises effectively, as we have seen in our discussion and will see further. The adaptation theory, meanwhile, holds that flexibility and adaptation are the most important aspect in any response to crisis. Christensen et al. In 2016 argued just this, that there is no perfect organizational framework capable of achieving effective crisis management. Ken Cash in 2014 implied that monetary intervention, nevertheless, by central governments can mitigate the worst effects of a global crisis. In essence, he compared the responses of Scandinavian countries who spent more on welfare than South European countries during the 2008 financial crisis. During these trying times, this researcher found that Scandinavian countries that funded more social welfare had better outcomes economically during this crisis than those countries that did not. This last argument is supported by our discussion above. To answer the question of whether these three variables were related in some way in gauging the effect of pandemic containment efforts, I quantified socioeconomic development using 2018 values for the Human Development Index, political rights using this year's values for the Freedom Index, and I created my own pandemic performance coefficient to measure the extent to which the pandemic was contained within each country's borders. And the way in which I designed the pandemic performance coefficient is using the formula that is shown on the screen, where C is cases per 100,000 people, that's per 100,000 people, and S, Government Stringency Index developed by Oxford, which were obtained using a median date value between March 11, 2020, which was when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a global pandemic, and October 20, 2020, which was when the data was processed and the study finalized. And this median date was June 30, 2020. So I obtained 58 data points for 58 countries for which all of this data were available. And using a Excel sheet, I processed these 58 data points or sets of data points, and I utilized this formula to create the pandemic performance coefficient. The score distribution of the 58 data points ranged from 0 to 1, with 1 being the highest scoring country, and the rest of the distribution is scoring lower than this highest scoring country that got the score of 1. And as it is implied by this discussion, countries that fared better in containing the local outbreak of COVID-19 had a score nearer to 1, while those that fared worse scored lower than 1 significantly. And the results of my analysis, which was consisting of summary statistics that describe the significance of the Freedom Index and the Human Development Index and its relationship to the pandemic performance coefficient, in analyzing its significance, as well as its p-values and its coefficient of correlation were the following. Once I read a correlation matrix, I found that there was actually a negative correlation between pandemic performance outcomes and human development index, as you can see intersection between PPC and HDI scores in the matrix on the left. The p-values were extremely small, which I will discuss later in the presentation. However, this seems counterintuitive to what many scientists argue in the relationship between the human development index and the coping mechanism that each country has to manage internal crisis. And we can see right here that there were very few countries that scored high on the distribution of PPC scores, which the Solomon Islands and Laos obtaining this honor, while the vast majority of countries have mediocre scores that wasn't even in the middle of the distribution of PPC scores. And there were exactly 18 countries that had the famous connotation of scoring in the lowest possible range. As you can see, the distribution of PPC scores was not normal, and in the three-variable significance analysis, we can see that this has an effect on the results that I got. The relationship between the two independent variables, which were the freedom index and the human development index, had a value of 0.2074, which was way above the significant threshold of 0.05 required for statistical significance, and the explanatory power, as indicated by the adjusted R-square statistics, was extremely small, which implies that there is no significant, that the relationship between the three variables is not statistically significant, and that there is no evidence that freedom index and human socioeconomic development has any effect on the capacity of each country of managing their local outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. And while examining the relationship separately between each independent variable and the dependent variable, which was the PPC score, we can see that for the freedom index, the p-value was 0.1441 and the adjusted R-square was extremely small as well, which indicates that freedom and liberties, political liberties, did not have a great effect upon pandemic containment effort outcomes. The same can be said about human development and economic capacity of each country with a p-value of 0.08. However, there seems to be a greater influence of socioeconomic development than in political rights, as indicated by the relative distribution of p-values between both of these variables relationships. We can conclude that none of the relationships are statistically significant, that development has a greater explanatory power than political freedoms, as we have seen recently. Laos and Solomon Islands best managed their COVID-19 outbreak. Meanwhile, Yemen and Mexico were the worst performing countries. Our results and this rejection of any hypothesis is consistent with the views expressed in Christensen et al. In 2016, or the advanced validity theory that we have seen earlier. The data may have been affected by the lack of COVID-19 testing and death underreporting in socioeconomically poor countries, and more current studies are needed to solely ascertain whether there is a relationship between socioeconomic development, political rights, and pandemic performances in the light of the emerging variants. These results present significant implications for the study of international crisis management and public health. Thank you.